All right, this one's for you moms and dads that have been joining Facebook groups, looking for specialists, making appointments with tons and tons of different doctors to take care of your child who is chronically sick and chronically stressed. Today, we're talking about the perfect storm. We're going to bring a little bit of light onto the topic and hopefully give you guys a little bit of hope, help you find some answers, and ultimately lead you to something that will help. Rates of chronic illness in kids are rising rapidly, and it's terrible. It's absolutely horrendous. We've noted that over the past 10 years, that ADHD and behavior problems in kids range from 10 to 15% and are climbing every day, every month, every year. Anxiety in kids was 11.6% and has nearly doubled to 20.5% just due to the pandemic we've recently weathered. Depression in kids was about 8.5%. It's more than doubled to 25.2% due to the pandemic. That's tripled. Overall mental illness in kids now affects 1 in 6. And autism rates have increased 241% just since 2000. This is 1 in 44 kids that are being diagnosed. That's a lot. So traditionally, when we look at some of these problems, we've been assigned to, well, it's a genetic thing. We can do genetic testing. We can look and see if your child is going to be predisposed to X, Y, or Z. And largely, that's been what we get to go off from. If you look at Dr. Bruce Lipton's work, he's looked into a field called epigenetics, which is something that I think that we should really start talking a little bit more about, because it's not just your genetics, but it's what your environment brings out in your genetics that causes different things to be expressed and therefore different presentations to be seen. And looking at cases upon cases of kids with differing levels of severity and problems and subjective complaints from their parents, from their schools, from their teachers, from the kids themselves, from their siblings, I've looked over tons and tons of data and spoken with a network of other doctors who see pediatric cases and look at things from a neurospinal perspective. And the common factor in everything is looking at the child's central and autonomic nervous systems. So as we're finding this common link, it's important to look through a child's case history, look through their birth process, look through mom's pregnancy, see how everything has gone, see what stressors have been applied, and really put it all together to see what we can do by finding the root cause of this child's problem. One really common thing we see with perfect storm cases is birth trauma. And when we're talking about birth trauma, we're looking at inductions, we're looking at C-sections, we're looking at vacuum assists, we're looking at forceps, we're looking at births that do not go, not always super easy, because birth is a stressful process. But all of these outside factors being put in that give a traumatic event to mom, to baby, and ultimately looking at what's happening in that upper part of the cervical spine, that brain and nervous system, because when you have a newborn baby and somebody hands you that newborn baby, the first thing they say is, support the head, support the head, support the head. Meanwhile, we're looking at C-section videos of, well, the lever's the head, we're getting that baby out somehow. If we're looking at vacuum assist, that traction process, if we're looking at forceps, that's a lot of strain that's coming into that upper part of the cervical spine and the skull complex. So looking at the bones of the cervical spine and the skull, they're not just there for structure. They're not there just to give shape. They're built to house and protect the most important system of the entire body, the central and autonomic nervous system. And that central and autonomic nervous system is going to regulate and control every single process that happens throughout the rest of the body. So if we're working with a base of genetics and we have all these environmental factors that are going to come into play with epigenetics, and if that nervous system is not functioning efficiently and properly, if we're looking at the nervous system as a highway, and that highway is letting all of the different senses and information travel on it like cars, well, a nice smooth highway, things go really well, and you're able to regulate and send messages from sensory to brain to decrypt and descramble and send it back out to either motor or thought or memory or speech. But if that road's super bumpy, then this process of decoding everything coming in from sensory to be turned into output, well, that bumpy road is going to make this process much more difficult for a child, which might show up as taking a little bit extra time to copy notes from the board, or getting distracted easily, or having an overactive response to a situation that's not a big deal. We see meltdowns start in the terrible twos, and while that's kind of a normal thing, we don't want to see them progress to 5, 6, 7, 8, 12, 14, 16 years old. And meanwhile, each year it gets a little bit more severe, they last a little bit longer, and they happen a little bit more often. So the stress that we see in the prenatal period, during pregnancy, and in the early part of life, in the past couple of years, it's been amplified. We now have kids that have this overarching fear of a lot of different things. They haven't necessarily been in a whole lot of social situations, so we got that social anxiety coming in. The constant stress and fear piling on has amplified this problem. So if we're looking at the bones of the skull, the upper neck, and the rest of the spine, and we have an injury early on in the birth process, that immediately is going to start to alter the function of the processing in the central and autonomic nervous system. Therefore, everything down the line that is affected upon or controlled by that central and autonomic nervous system, they will be affected too. These are things like controlling nerves and muscles responsible for breastfeeding, controlling nerves and muscles responsible for digestion, controlling nerves and muscles responsible for draining fluid from the ears and sinuses, and regulating our immune system and our inflammatory cascades, controlling and regulating all sensory processing, whether that be eyes, auditory, smell, touch, vestibular and balance are big ones, and then also motor, movement. Those are extremely important when we're talking about proprioception and knowing where the body is in space. And then also controlling and regulating that motor development, milestones, tone, balance, and coordination. See, motor and sensory kind of feed off and play off each other. The development of motor helps sensory. The development of sensory helps motor. And if we're working with sensory information that's not being processed properly, then that central nervous system and the brain can't necessarily put out the perfect motor output that we should be putting out. We will see some changes there. It controls speech development and function, and controls and regulates all internal brain communication and coordination. We're talking about social, emotional, behavioral, memory, and decision making. And there's one piece of that autonomic nervous system that is connecting all of this together, and that's the vagus nerve. That nerve that comes down is the wandering nerve of the autonomic nervous system and tends to have its hands in everything. And if we're seeing vagal dysfunction, then we're going to see a vast array of a lot of different things not going correctly. And when we have a vast array of a bunch of things not going correctly and they tick certain boxes of certain disorders, then we get children labeled with syndromes. And it's not to say that all of these areas are dysfunctional and should be classified as a syndrome. They fall within that. That is the medical diagnosis. But when we're talking about a syndrome being a collection of symptoms and what it is exhibiting, it just is a summary of what's going on. It doesn't necessarily tell us why. And so if we have this vagal connection and we can look at that child's central and autonomic nervous system, measure them and say, these are functioning properly, or these are not functioning properly, we can build a little bit deeper insight into understanding why that central nervous system is not functioning properly, why that autonomic system is not functioning properly, everything downstream there not functioning properly. And ultimately, if we can address the function of that central and autonomic nervous system through neuro-focused pediatric chiropractic care, then we can focus on helping this nervous system to function better, as opposed to looking at this litany of symptoms and just trying to treat each one of those on its own. So oftentimes when we're talking about perfect storm kids, we'll start with something. Call it X, call it Y, call it Z, don't really care. But that one something, we'll talk to our pediatrician, and the pediatrician may say, you know what, let's just wait and see. They should grow out of it. And that term right there, grow out of it, that's not necessarily how it always goes. Oftentimes what we'll see is they will grow out of something into another. And it's kind of this stepwise process where things aren't necessarily going away, they're just changing in form. We still have that at the base of it, disruption of the nervous system, but it's presenting a little bit differently. So technically it's a different symptom. And if we're looking at all these different symptoms, again, they can be put together. And it's not always a sequential process, but oftentimes when we start with a fussy, colicky, constipated, or sleep-challenged infant, and then see a sensory, constantly sick, challenging baby to toddler stage, meaning we might see some antibiotics or steroid-based anti-inflammatory medications over and over and over again. And then we see constantly wound up, sensory overwhelmed, hyperactive, impulsive, emotional, stuck children, which then leads us to focus, concentration, organization, social and emotional regulation, challenged grade school kids. And eventually that ends up as an exhausted, angry, anxious, depressed teenager. And oftentimes when we start talking through some of these processes, a parent will stop us and say, hey, this is my kid. How do you know? And I'll be honest, I'm not clairvoyant, but I do know how to recognize patterns, and I do know that we're seeing a whole lot of this. One huge positive in all of this is parents are starting to come around to this. We've posted about trusting the mom and dad gut, and that's a really big thing. Oftentimes, a second, a third, a fourth opinion from multiple pediatricians is sought just because something doesn't seem right. In a situation like that, it doesn't make sense to not listen to mom and dad, because if they're not seeing any changes by waiting and seeing, well, you maybe have to look at something through a little bit different lens. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the nervous system through a little bit different lens, and we're looking at the kid through a little bit different lens. The fact that parents are asking more questions and they're looking for more proactive ways to take care of their children as opposed to just relying on medication is a really, really good thing. And I like seeing that that's happening now more than ever. It's crazy to look at some of the side effects of these drugs that young kids are being put on. There's often times where it's typically an adult drug that's just given in smaller amounts, and you're trading one symptom for one side effect, or one symptom for 5 side effects. And if we're so focused on the one symptom that we don't want to see, then we tend to lose track of our place when we see all these other side effects kind of bouncing up and saying, well, now what do I do for this? And what do I do for this? What do I do for this? So always keep advocating for your kids, looking into and doing research and truly vetting things out. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but hopefully we've got a little bit of thought-inducing conversation going on. And if you have questions, please ask me. If I don't know the answer right away, I'll read, I'll research, I'll come together, we'll talk through it, we'll figure it out. And I think that that's a really powerful thing between a provider and the people they care for, is an open dialogue and some understanding. So what's our action steps here? You may be, just like I described earlier, on your 4th pediatrician. Your child may have 7 or 8 different therapists and therapy appointments that they're seeing throughout the week. And all of those different therapy appointments are helping your child in different ways. We're looking at helping those vehicles on that highway to run a little bit better. But if there's something that's not quite connecting it all together, talking to a neurologically focused pediatric chiropractor is where you want to take your next steps. If you can optimize the road that all of those different therapies and vehicles are driving on, then they will work better. Oftentimes we get reports from PTs and OTs and other therapists that not only are their sessions being better overall in terms of the progress they're able to make, but the children are able to do more at those appointments, not getting exhausted as easily, because their central nervous system, everything that's taking the information in to process and then output into the action for that therapy, is more resilient. It's functioning in a better way, and it's doing the things that it's supposed to easier. Everything that we've described about the changing of symptoms and the outputs and growing from one thing into another, it kind of all zeroes in on dysfunction of the nervous system. And for the sake of putting a label on it, we call that subluxation. I recommend that everybody takes a look on our blog. I outline very clearly what I look at as subluxation, and it would probably put this video double in length, so I'm not going to go through it right now. Essentially, when we're looking at subluxation and dysfunction within that nervous system, we can simplify it down into stress stuck on. Your child is stuck in that fight or flight state, they can't self-regulate, and that's where their air traffic control, or that autonomic nervous system of the body, is being overwhelmed by stress. The stress response deregulates or doesn't allow them to express the normal living function that they should, and then we get all those fun symptoms we already talked about. So rewinding it back and talking about birth trauma, if early on we see insult or injury into the upper part of the neck, Well, if it sets up shop there, it's gonna get stuck. And if we're limiting movement, which is the key to starting everything, we're going to have a problem. If present from birth, it's going to alter the most important of all developmental and childhood milestones, motor and movement. Movement is life, neurology is life. They are intricately related. So for action steps, what can you do? First off, if you're in our area, let us know. Give us a call, get a hold of us. If you're not in our area, do the same. We can get you connected with somebody in our network that looks at your child from a neurological pediatric chiropractic perspective. In our practice, we look at 3 metrics to measure your child's nervous system, and within a half an hour, we can get through a detailed case history, we can assess the function of your child's nervous system, and most importantly, let you know if it's something that we can help with. If we can't, we know the places that we'll be able to. But in most circumstances, after coming up with the why of assessing and evaluating your child's nervous system for dysfunction, we can then figure out the how to help it function better, and we can answer 3 questions. Can neurologically focused pediatric chiropractic help? If yes, how long will it take to restore neurological function? If yes, what exact chiropractic approach in specific areas must be addressed first? Now, number 2 and 3 are more of the technical aspect of my side of things. The real thing here is you want to know the answer to number 1. So if this jumped out at you, if this is something that you've been thinking about for a while, if this is something you've been dealing with for a while, if this is something that puts strain on your family, if it puts strain on your life, if it puts strain on your child, give us a call now. We often find that having a conversation before coming in can give parents just a little bit more confidence that this is the right place to be for their child. And also, if you're thinking, well, this might work for that kid, but it probably won't work for my kid, again, check out our website. We have a bunch of different stories of hope put on there that chronicle the stories of young kids that have had challenges, that have overcome those challenges, and that are now doing so well. And it's such a great thing to see. I'm here for you. I'm here for your kids. When you're ready, let me know. I'll see you soon.